On February 3rd, 1976, a 20-year-old college dropout sat down and wrote a letter so blunt, so genuinely furious in tone, that it would go on to be reprinted in half a dozen computer magazines, provoke a wave of angry responses from the exact community it was addressed to, and decades later, still get cited as one of the founding documents of the entire modern debate over software. Piracy and intellectual property. The 20-year-old was Bill Gates. The letter was addressed not to a rival company, not to a government regulator, but to his own customers, the hobbyists who were at that exact moment the only people in the entire world actually using his company's software. Think about how strange that positioning actually is, from a purely ordinary business standpoint. Companies write angry letters to competitors. They write formal complaints to regulators. They rarely, if ever, publicly furiously accuse the exact community keeping their fledgling business alive of theft, in print, distributed nationally under their own name, while still a 20-year-old running what was, at the time, a genuinely tiny and precarious operation with no guarantee of surviving the year. This is the story of that letter, what specifically provoked it, what it actually said, how the hobbyist community responded, and why a piece of writing from a struggling 20-person software company in Albuquerque, New Mexico, would end up shaping the entire commercial logic of the software industry for the next 50 years. Let's start with the actual situation Gates found himself in at the start of 1976, because understanding just how precarious his company's position genuinely was is essential to understanding why this specific letter came out as angry as it did. Gates and his business partner Paul Allen had founded a tiny software company, initially called Microsoft, with a hyphen that would eventually get dropped, built around a single flagship product, a version of the BASIC programming language, adapted specifically to run on the Altair 8800. One of the very first commercially available personal computers, built by a company called MITS in Albuquerque. Getting that product built at all had been a genuine race against time. Gates and Allen, along with a fellow Harvard student named Monty Davidoff, had built a working BASIC interpreter under simulation on a PDP-10 mainframe at Harvard, racing to have something usable before any competing team could beat them to it. By July of 1975, they'd signed a contract with MITS, $3,000 up front, plus royalties on every copy sold. $30 for the basic 4K version, $35 for the 8K version, $60 for the more expanded version, with the entire royalty arrangement capped at $180,000 total, and MITS retaining exclusive worldwide licensing rights to the software for 10 years. That deal structure meant Gates and Allen's entire fragile business depended almost completely on people actually paying for individual copies of BASIC as it sold through MITS. There was no other significant revenue stream keeping the company afloat at this point. No venture capital cushion, no secondary product line, just this one piece of software and whatever royalty trickled back to them each time somebody actually purchased a legitimate copy. It's worth appreciating just how much personal risk Gates had actually taken on to get to this specific point. He had left Harvard without a degree, specifically to pursue this business, a decision his own parents, by multiple later accounts, were genuinely uneasy about, given how uncertain the entire personal computer industry's future still looked in the mid-1970s. This wasn't a hobby. Project for Gates himself, whatever the community he was selling to might have believed about the underlying nature of the work. It was a direct, personal financial bet, made at considerable cost to his own more conventional, already secured academic and career trajectory, on the idea that this specific piece of software could become a genuine, sustainable business. And that's exactly where the problem started. By the end of 1975, MIT was shipping roughly 1,000 Altair computers a month. But a genuinely successful pace for a brand new product category nobody had really seen before. But BASIC itself was selling in only the low hundreds. Not low hundreds as a percentage, low hundreds as an absolute number, against a customer base of thousands of machines already in hobbyists' hands. The math here is genuinely stark. By Gates' own accounting, less than 10% of Altair owners who were actually using BASIC had ever paid for it. It's worth sitting with exactly how that gap happened, because it wasn't really a mystery, and Gates himself understood precisely what was going on. The early personal computer hobbyist community, centered around clubs like the famous Homebrew Computer Club in the San Francisco Bay Area, operated on a genuinely different cultural assumption about software than the one that would eventually come to dominate the industry. Hardware, in this community's shared understanding, was something you paid for, a physical Altair. Computer cost real money, and nobody expected to get one for free. Software, by contrast, was widely treated as something closer to a shared communal resource. If you had it, sharing a copy with a fellow hobbyist wasn't considered stealing. It was considered the whole point of being part of a community built around collectively figuring out this strange, exciting, genuinely new kind of machine together. It's worth understanding where that specific cultural assumption actually came from, since it wasn't simply casual indifference to Gates's financial situation. Many of the earliest personal computer hobbyists came directly out of academic and engineering cultures. University computing labs, amateur radio clubs, and similar communities were a strong, genuinely held tradition of freely sharing technical schematics, code, and know-how already existed as an established norm long before anyone was trying to build a commercial personal computer industry out of it. To many of these hobbyists, treating a piece of basic code the same way they'd treat a shared circuit diagram or a useful subroutine passed between friends wasn't a deliberate act of defiance against Gates specifically. It was simply an extension of a pre-existing cultural practice into a new technical domain, one that hadn't yet developed its own separate, commercially oriented norms. The specific incident that crystallized this dynamic, and that historical accounts specifically point to as a triggering moment, involved a homebrew computer club member named Dan Sokol. According to detailed retrospective accounts, Sokol somehow obtained a pre-market copy of the basic interpreter tape, and using a teletype machine, made roughly 25 copies of it, which he then distributed at the next homebrew computer club meeting, reportedly urging the recipients to make even more copies themselves, and to pass those along too. That's not a quiet, isolated instance of casual sharing. That's a deliberate, organized act of mass duplication, happening in a public club meeting, treated by at least some participants as something close to a point of pride rather than something to hide. It's worth understanding the specific mechanics of how this kind of mass copying actually happened at these club meetings, since it wasn't a purely abstract digital process the way software piracy might look today. Attendees would bring their own tape readers and duplication equipment directly to the meetings, treating the on-site, in-person mass production of copied tapes as a genuinely normal, even celebrated part of the club's regular gathering. Less an act of secretive rule-breaking and more an open, communal ritual the club had organically built around exactly this kind of software distribution. That specific detail matters, because it means the piracy Gates was responding to wasn't happening in the shadows. It was happening openly, socially, as an accepted and even encouraged practice within the exact community his company most needed to convert into paying customers. So Gates, watching his company's flagship, and at that point, essentially only product get copied and redistributed at a rate that dwarfed actual legitimate sales, sat down and wrote his response. And it's worth reading the actual language of that letter closely, because the specific phrasing tells you exactly how personally and how professionally Gates experienced this situation. The letter opens relatively measured, noting that the feedback Microsoft had received from the hundreds of people using BASIC had all been positive. A genuinely interesting detail, since it means Gates wasn't disputing that his product was good, or that people genuinely wanted and valued it. The problem, as he laid it out explicitly, was twofold. First, that less than 10% of Altair owners who were using BASIC had actually purchased it. And second, that the royalties Microsoft had actually received made the total time invested in building Altair BASIC worth less than $2 an hour. $2 an hour. It's worth pausing on that specific figure because it's not an abstract complaint about lost potential profit. It's Gates doing genuinely concrete personal math about the actual hourly value of the labor he and his small team had put into this project, and finding that number humiliatingly, unsustainably low, even by the standards of an unpaid hobby, let alone a professional software business trying to establish itself. For context, even a genuinely modest hourly wage in 1976 dollars would have represented a meaningfully better return than what Gates was calculating his own skilled, specialized programming labor was actually worth, once the piracy was fully accounted for. Then the letter turns considerably sharper. As the majority of hobbyists must be aware, Gates wrote, most of you steal your software. Hardware must be paid for, but software is something to share. Who cares if the people who worked on it get paid? That's about as direct an accusation as a business owner can level at the exact community he depends on for his company's survival. Not a diplomatically hedged complaint about unauthorized copying or licensing compliance, but a blunt personal accusation of theft addressed directly to the people doing it. Gates went further still, directly challenging the community's underlying assumptions about how software creation actually worked. As a business, who can afford to do professional work for nothing, he asked. What hobbyist can put 3-man years into programming, finding all bugs, documenting his product, and distribute it for free? That specific framing, professional work, 3 years of combined effort, careful bug fixing, and documentation, was Gates's attempt to reframe the entire debate. He wasn't asking hobbyists to stop being hobbyists. He was arguing that what he and his small team had built wasn't a hobby project at all, but genuine, sustained, skilled professional labor, and that treating it as freely shareable community property fundamentally misunderstood what had actually gone into creating it. That specific rhetorical move, insisting on a clear distinction between hobbyist tinkering and genuine professional software engineering, is worth examining closely because it's doing real argumentative work beyond simple frustration. Gates was implicitly conceding that casual, small-scale, hobbyist code genuinely might reasonably be treated as freely shareable, community property, the way a lot of simple utility programs and demos circulating within the club plausibly were. His argument was narrower and more specific than a blanket claim that all software everywhere deserved payment. It was that a genuinely substantial, professionally executed piece of software, something requiring 3 combined years of skilled labor, careful debugging, and real documentation, occupied a fundamentally different category, one that couldn't survive on the same casual share-alike norms that worked fine for smaller, more casual hobbyist projects. The letter closes on a note that's worth including in full because it reveals something genuinely important about what Gates actually wanted out of this confrontation, beyond simply venting frustration. "Nothing would please me more," he wrote, "than being able to hire 10 programmers and deluge the hobby market with good software. That's not the language of someone trying to shut down or punish the hobbyist community. It's the language of someone arguing that a sustainable, paid software business would ultimately produce more and better software for that exact community if only the community's own behavior would actually allow that business to become sustainable in the first place." It's worth understanding exactly how this letter actually reached its audience, because the distribution itself is a small but genuinely interesting piece of the story. Dave Bonnell, an editor at MITS's own publication, Computer Notes, took the letter and sent it via special delivery mail to essentially every major computer publication in the country. It went on to run in the Homebrew Computer Club's own newsletter, in Computer Notes itself, in Mini Computer News, in People's Computer Company's publication, and in Radio Electronics magazine, meaning Gates's letter wasn't a private grievance quietly circulated among a small circle. It was actively, deliberately amplified across essentially the entire print ecosystem serving the early personal computing hobbyist world, guaranteeing it would land directly in front of the specific community it was criticizing at genuine scale. It's worth noting that Bunnell himself and MITS more broadly weren't neutral bystanders simply relaying Gates's complaint. Bunnell had already written months earlier in a separate September 1975 issue of Computer Notes that customers had been ripping off Emites software, meaning Emites itself shared Gates's underlying frustration directly, since unpaid copying of Altair Basic hurt MITS's own royalty-sharing arrangement with Microsoft just as much as it hurt Gates and Allen's fledgling company. That alignment of interests is part of why MITS was willing to actively amplify Gates's letter so aggressively across the entire hobbyist press, rather than simply letting it circulate quietly on its own. So how did that community actually respond? Not well, by most accounts, and certainly not with the kind of immediate, chastened compliance Gates might have hoped for. The reaction, according to detailed historical retrospectives, was significant and largely defensive. A meaningful portion of the hobbyist community pushed back directly against Gates's underlying argument, with many specifically arguing that software should simply be bundled together with hardware, rather than sold separately at all, a fundamentally different vision of how the entire industry should work, one where the physical machine itself was the product being paid for, and the software running on it was simply part of what made that machine useful, not a separately monetized asset in its own right. It's worth understanding just how genuinely widespread and vocal that pushback actually was, rather than assuming it was a small, marginal fringe reaction. Gates's letter didn't simply get quietly noted and set aside. It generated real, sustained public debate within the hobbyist press over the following months, with multiple publications, running follow-up commentary, letters to the editor, and direct rebuttals. This wasn't a case of a controversial opinion being aired once and quickly forgotten. It touched off a genuine, extended argument about the fundamental nature of software as property, playing out across the exact print publications that served as this community's primary shared communication channel at the time. One of the more substantive published responses came from Jim Warren, editor of Dr. Dobbs' journal, a genuinely influential publication in the early hobbyist computing world. Writing in April of 1976, Warren specifically pointed to the success of a competing project called Tiny Basic, a deliberately simplified version of the BASIC language whose code was published and made freely available for anyone to copy entirely by design as a direct, principled counterpoint to Gates's commercial model. Tiny Basic's very existence and its genuine popularity within the hobbyist community served as a kind of practical rebuttal to Gates's argument. Here was proof, Warren and others argued, that meaningful, useful software could exist and spread successfully without the commercial licensing structure Gates was insisting was necessary. It's worth sitting with that specific counterargument for a moment, because it represents a genuinely coherent alternative philosophy. not simply hobbyists rationalizing bad behavior. The free software, share-alike ethos that Tiny Basic represented wasn't simply an excuse for avoiding payment. It reflected a real considered belief among a meaningful portion of the early computing community that software, unlike hardware, was fundamentally different in kind, infinitely reproducible at essentially zero marginal cost, and therefore, in this view, more naturally suited to a communal, freely shared model than a traditional commercial product ever could be. That's genuinely the same underlying philosophical tension that would, decades later, become the entire foundation of the open source and free software movements. Linux, and everything built on top of it, sits philosophically much closer to the Tiny Basic side of this specific 1976 argument than to Gates's side. That's exactly what makes this particular letter such a genuinely significant historical document, well beyond its immediate, narrow context of one struggling company trying to collect royalties on one piece of software in 1976. The open letter to hobbyists represents one of the earliest, most explicit, most directly argued statements of the proprietary software philosophy that would go on to define Microsoft's entire business model and much of the software industry more broadly for the following half-century. And the pushback it generated, the Tiny Basic counterexample, the software should be bundled with hardware argument, the broader share-alike ethos of the early hobbyist community, represents an equally early, equally explicit articulation of exactly the opposing philosophy that would eventually produce the free and open source software movement, culminating years later in projects like Linux itself. In other words, this single letter, written by a 20-year-old in 1976, sits almost precisely at the fork in the road between the two. Competing philosophies of software ownership that this channel has spent an enormous amount of time covering in other contexts. Microsoft's proprietary, commercially licensed model on one side, and the open, freely shared model that Linux and the broader open source movement would eventually build on the other. Gates wasn't simply having a one-off dispute with some frustrated hobbyists in 1976. He was, whether he fully realized it at the time or not, staking out one specific foundational position in a debate about the fundamental nature of software as intellectual property, a debate that's still actively playing out today in different specific forms across every story. This channel covers about Microsoft, Linux, and the broader relationship between proprietary and open software. It's worth asking, honestly, who actually had the better argument in 1976, rather than simply assuming history retroactively vindicated one side or the other. Gates' underlying practical point, that sustained professional software development genuinely requires some form of compensation to remain viable at scale, has proven durably true in the sense that Microsoft itself and the broader proprietary software industry built on similar licensing logic went on to become one of the largest, most consequential industries in the entire global economy. But the counter-argument the hobbyists were making, that a genuinely different model built on voluntary collaboration, shared code, and non-proprietary licensing could also produce serious, professional-grade, widely used software, has proven equally durably true, vindicated decades later by Linux's own dominance across servers, cloud, infrastructure, and mobile devices, built by exactly the kind of decentralized, non-commercial collaborative process the 1976 hobbyists were defending against Gates's criticism. Neither side, in other words, was simply wrong. Both models turned out to be genuinely viable, sustainable approaches to building serious software. They just ended up dominating different specific corners of the computing world, with proprietary licensing largely winning the desktop operating system and productivity software markets for decades, while the open, collaborative model Gates was specifically criticizing in 1976 eventually came to dominate an enormous share of server, infrastructure, cloud computing, and mobile operating systems instead. It's genuinely worth noting how strange it would have seemed to either side of this 1976 argument to learn how things actually turned out. Gates could hardly have predicted that the exact company he was building around strict proprietary licensing would, decades later, become one of the largest corporate contributors to the very open source movement his letter was implicitly arguing against. And the hobbyists defending free communal software sharing in 1976 could hardly have predicted that their underlying philosophy would eventually produce not a fringe alternative, but the actual operating system running the majority of the world's internet infrastructure. Both outcomes would have looked like genuine surprises to anyone actually present for this original 1976 exchange. There's a specific irony worth sitting with as we close out, one that connects this 50-year-old letter directly to stories this channel has covered about much more recent Microsoft history. The same basic tension Gates articulated in 1976, professional, paid later, more openly hostile conflict with the free and open source software movement, from Steve Ballmer's infamous Cancer comment about Linux in 2001, through Joachim Kempen's documented anti-Linux OEM pressure campaign in the early 2000s, all the way through to Microsoft's eventual, genuine institutional embrace of open source under Satya Nadella decades later. The specific battle lines shifted considerably over that 50-year span, and Microsoft's own position within that debate evolved. Dramatically, from a company built explicitly around the proprietary model Gates defended in 1976, to eventually becoming one of the largest corporate contributors to open source projects in the world. But the underlying philosophical question Gates raised as a 20-year-old, who should get paid for software and how, never actually got settled. It just kept finding new specific forms to play out in, decade after decade, with this 1976 letter standing as one of the very first times anyone articulated the proprietary side of that argument, this explicitly, this publicly, and this early in the entire history of personal computing. It's worth tracing that specific through line one more time, because it's genuinely remarkable how consistently this exact tension resurfaces across Microsoft's history in different costumes. A 20-year-old accusing hobbyists of theft in 1976, a CEO comparing an entire operating system to a disease in 2001, a senior executive quietly instructing OEMs to be less gracious toward a competitor without being obvious about it, a decade after that. And finally, the same company shipping its own Linux distribution, contributing code directly to the kernel, and running enormous cloud infrastructure on the exact open source model it spent decades fighting. That's not four separate, unrelated stories. That's one continuous argument about the fundamental nature of software as property, playing out across 50 years inside a single company, starting with one furious letter from a 20-year-old who hadn't yet figured out how it would all eventually turn out. I want to know how you read this letter, now that you've heard the full context behind it. Does Gates's underlying argument that sustained professional software development requires paid compensation to remain viable still hold up as the stronger position, or has Linux and the broader open source movement's own decades of success proven the hobbyists' original counter-argument was closer to the truth all along? And does, knowing that this exact tension traces all the way back to a 20-year-old's furious letter in 1976, change how you think about Microsoft's much more recent and much more contentious history with Linux? Specifically, tell me in the comments. I think this is genuinely one of the most consequential documents in the entire history of software, and it deserves a lot more attention than it usually gets. If you want more grounded coverage of the real history behind the software industry's biggest, longest-running debates, traced all the way back to where they actually started, subscribe, hit the bell so you don't miss the next one, and I'll see you in the next video.